He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 27 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back with another episode, Henry. Today, we have 2 guests. I was a guest on their podcast called Marketing Smarts. They are Candido and April Martini. They also run an agency called Forthright People. Let's let them tell us a little more about who they are. It's a great conversation. All right. Well, Henry, we're back for another episode, and I am delighted to welcome, I would say, 2 new friends. I was a guest on their podcast called Marketing Smarts. They are April Martini and Candido, and they are the hosts of Marketing Smarts. They also have a company called Forthright People. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So you know what? I'm going to let you introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about what you do and why you do it. And then I've got a bunch of questions and want to talk about how much fun I had on your podcast, and we'll see where the conversation goes. So welcome. Henry and I are proud to have you here. Welcome to the Brief Brothers.
Thank you. Yeah, we appreciate it. So I'll go first. I'm April Martini, half of the Forthright People duo. We joined forces, about 3 years ago.
3 years ago,
which is so crazy to think it's been 3 years. But really, what brought us together is philosophical alignment on how to do work for clients and how to treat clients, and really this belief that there was perhaps a better, more efficient way to get clients what they needed when they needed it, and not necessarily to follow our agenda, but follow their agenda. And so we are opposite sides of the fence. So I have spent 15 years at other agencies, started my own sort of sub agency. Anne will introduce herself, but 20 years at Procter & Gamble. And that in and of itself is a talking piece for folks. It's not something you often see, and you guys know. For a corporate and an agency person to join forces is a little bit funny. But what we do for our clients is we provide them on demand whatever they need at whatever point in time. And so we come in and they might say, we want a website. And we say, that's great. Why do you want a website? And we kind of peel back the layers until we get to the brand questions. You know, what do you have? What do you not have? We're not, again, imposing our agenda or our process, but we want to make sure that you're set up so that any business decision you make can happen through the lens of brand, and it's the right decision. And then we can go and do whatever you need us to create. We are happy to do that. But we got to start back here to make sure that strategically we have those things aligned and they're there and there's something we can work from. So I'm sure you want to build on that. We have no shortage of talk. So
yeah, and I have to draw Henry out all the time because he doesn't like to talk at all. So we're going to have a hard time. We're going to have a hard time talking today.
Yeah, it's not about being drawn out. It's about given the opportunity to speak. I think is actually the difference. But so I'm Anne Candido, the other half of the duo, and everything April said, I absolutely echo. But I'm actually an engineer by background, so I didn't start in the branding and marketing realm, and evolved there through my years at P&G. Basically, because I wanted to get closer to decision making. That's really what the impetus was. But I spent the first 10 years in R&D and product package development, then in product development and products research, and then went into branding and marketing and influencer marketing and PR specifically, and decided that after 20 years, I wanted to actually build something. And so I decided to leave P&G for the opportunity to build something specifically formulated around brands and businesses' opportunity to cultivate brand love. And that really, to me, was the impetus of being able to take commoditized products and really being able to generate this love and affinity for something and being able then to generate legacy from that. I mean, that's the only way Tide, for example, which is a brand that I worked on and still love, can be around for 75 years. It's a laundry detergent, for heaven's sakes, but it's a $1 billion brand and it's been around for 75 years. It's because it's cultivated brand love. So what we like to say is it doesn't matter what widget you make. If you can cultivate that brand love, then you can cultivate an experience that people are going to come back to and they're going to want to elicit, and you create that relationship. So that's really like a lot of the fundamental purpose that April and I came together. And actually the real story, if you grant me 2 seconds to tell that story, which people find very interesting, was I was ready for a partner. I needed to have more capacity to what I was offering. April was just kind of like an innocent bystander who had said, well, this year I'm going to take any meeting that was given to me. she didn't believe that like somebody's actually going to give her a P&G person, which she was like not real thrilled about to begin with. And so she's like, fine, I'm going to take this meeting. We met in a coffee shop. I was like in love in the minute I met her. She's like, okay, hold on a second. We need to actually like, see if this was going to work. But we spent like 3 hours kind of cultivating and or what we could like do together, and then it just kind of like went from there. But what we always like to say is we met like on the 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon. So for all of those out there who are like really hesitant to network and like decide like, am I going to go out with that person, meet with that person, what's the benefit of that, it was like a person of a person of a person of a person is how April and I met. And so I always like to reinforce that because it is like really the true power of networking too. So not necessarily a conversation for today, but I offer that.
Well, that's great. And it does not surprise me at all that what you started evolved, and I'm guessing rather quickly, into your podcast. I mean, it seemed like a natural extension of the energy that you have with each other. Let's bring this to a podcast. And so tell us, how did that get started?
Yeah, so we actually decided to sign on the dotted line a month before the pandemic hit.
Yep.
And so at first it was really interesting because a lot of people felt like they had more time and space, right? So the clients were rolling in actually. And then everyone got a little nervous and they were like, oh, we need to pull back. We're not sure. We're not sure how long this is going to last. It's longer than we thought. And so being marketers and branders, we thought, well, okay, fine. Let's spend this time building something that's meaningful so that when the world turns back on, quote unquote, we have something to offer people. And we went through really like a lot of diligence around what channels did we turn on social? Did we, what was our platform going to be? And Anne had done a series of podcasts with a PR and comm background, right? Been on other people's, and I hadn't. And then all of a sudden her people started asking me if I wanted to talk, and we got on one together. And to your point, the magic of the debate and the conversation, and I think just the realness of how we talk to each other was enticing to the person that we were on their podcast. And so he invited us to start a show on his channel, and we looked at each other and said, why not do it ourselves?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it was born right then, and we started drafting episodes, and we take this very seriously. We like homework. We're, really into like the diligence of it. And so we hired a studio, we started producing, and what came of it was a library of episodes that once we came out of the pandemic and businesses started coming back around again, we actually very rarely anymore RFP. We say, go listen to X podcast, which is relevant to what you're asking us to do, and you decide. If you like what you hear, you get the real take on how we work, how we talk to each other, how we interact with our guests. And then you come back and let us know if you want to work with us. And so it's been really awesome. It's been a great revenue generator from that perspective. And it's also found us clients that we connect with instantaneously because they've experienced us in quote unquote real time.
That's great. Go ahead, Henry.
No, I was gonna say, I wanted to, as I listened to the episode of your podcast that Howard was on, I knew I had to bring this topic up, and it serves two purposes. One is, since you guys represent historically the agency side and the client side, but it also feeds into our kind of creation myth as well, which was how we started this podcast. Was I knew Howard already for a few years. I had bought his book. I had brought him down to my agency to do a workshop among the strategists and the account people at my agency, and we had always kept in touch. I wrote a blurb for the back of like his second edition, I think. And so one day he texted me, and I was on a road trip with my son. It was spring break, and he texted me about this paper that the ANA had put out about the creative brief. And in the creative brief, in this paper, white paper, they said that the creative brief should be co-authored by the agency and the client. And I told Howard, like, we were texting, it was lunchtime, and I'm like, yeah, great in theory, horrible in practice. And he was like totally, he had like drank the Kool-Aid on it, and I was like, it just isn't gonna work. And then finally, like after like an hour of texting back and forth, I said, you know what, we should start a podcast where we can disagree and have all these things. But all that is to kind of, you guys alluded a little bit to the brief, or you talked about briefs because Howard was on your episode, but talking about like the the standard kind of way that I was brought up in the business was the client writes its marketing or its Marcom brief to the agency, and then the agency writes a creative brief, which is agency work product. And most of the times the client has to approve that brief, although I'm in principle against that. Like, to me, I think that once you receive and agree to the brief that the client gave you, then what you do from that point on, as long as it answers the client brief, should be at the discretion of the agency. And the reason I say that is because I really see the creative brief as the first step of the creative process rather than the last step of the order taking process. And I don't want to bring in an outsider into the kitchen while we're cooking what we're cooking. You know, I want to bring them the presented dish and say, this is the idea and this is how we got to it. And part of that is just as a practical matter. What I've seen happen is when a client has to approve a creative brief is that they start really parsing words. It becomes a catch-all. It's a cover your ass document that has to have every permutation in it. And it gets further and further away from being what it's supposed to be, which is an inspiring document that gets the creatives going and gets them sparking. So I just, having given my best defense for my approach, which is to let the agency do what you're hiring the agency to do. What do you guys think?
Well, I think that's a really good question because I will tell you, I still to this day question the two briefs. To be totally honest, I feel like it's more process oriented than it's actually creative process oriented. It's more like I felt like I was always writing a brief in order to be able to set the boundaries for the agency in a way that allowed us to monitor each other's work versus it was a stimulator to go do work. Like it was more like the agency was like putting on the hook, like you better put everything you want in that brief because if it's not in that brief, then we're not going to do it. And if we don't do it, then you know what? Then that's like, you know, different scope and that's more money and all those sorts of things. So I always actually struggled with the two briefs because I felt like they were serving very, very different purposes. And I could never understand why the brief wasn't actually one. And I think sometimes that process is still kind of stuck in the mindset of here's the client who's non-creative and they are just here doing their business stuff. And here's the agency who's supposed to be the creative agency and they're supposed to go do the creative stuff. I don't understand why we never brought the two together in a more harmonious way in order to be able to say, hey, you as the business side understand business. We on the creative side understand maybe a little bit more about the market, the industry, how the way other people have done it. Let's collaborate more in order to bring something to the forefront that we can both agree on. Because if not, what always happened was the agency would bring forth work and we'd be like, doesn't really meet the brief. But they were working against a creative brief, not the brief that we set, right? And so there always became like this like misunderstanding of what the real objectives were, which became really intensive with regards to iterations, with regards to the quality of the work, and something always seemed to get lost in translation. So for me, I never approved a creative brief because I was like, well, that's kind of your guys' process. Go do your process. As long as you're delivering against the objectives we want to do, then fine. But it always felt like it was the actual client brief that became like the bad guy, if you will, with regards to whether or not the work was met. But that's just my thought.
If we'd had this conversation 2 or 3 years ago, I might have been agreeing with you, but I have to confess that Henry has beat me down, and I now concede that his point is valid, and I think for good reason. I was listening to one of your episodes. It was a quick hit. And by the way, I'm going to steal some of your approaches. Your quick hit. Yeah, Henry, they do a full hour-long episode on a topic, and then they'll do a quick hit, which is basically they'll take 2 points out of the 4 or 5 that they did on the main episode and do a 10 or 12-minute version of that longer episodes. Just if you want to short a quick hit. So I was listening to the quick hit. Was called "Creative, Unlike Art, Needs to Be Objective versus Objective," and I forget the name of your guest, but he was the creative director for a design firm.
Yes.
And yes. And he had a beautiful analogy that I think, Henry, you would get. And we talk about this a lot because I believe in the concept of liberating constraint. His analogy was a study that he was,
Yep.
yeah, he recited a study from, of all places, a landscape architect who found that if you create a playground for children without a fence, they will hover closely around the playground set. But if you create that same playground and put a fence around the entire space, the children will not just play around the playground set, they'll play around everywhere, right up to the edge of the fence. Creatives need that fence. The creative brief is that fence. We resist the fence, but that's where the imagination springs. T.S. Eliot has talked about this. We talked about that. Michelangelo, as he looked at his piece of marble, it's about extracting the superfluous stuff. So I no longer disagree with Henry about this collaboration, because I think the creative brief is our, and I've been on agency side for many years, it's our property. It's the strategist's property. And it's curious to listen to you talk about your experience at P&G, because I think creatives really need, and creative leaders need to impress upon the client that creatives are not art to do good art, to beautiful art. It's to do commercial work that sells. So we understand the nature of the liberating constraint of a brief. That's why Ogilvy said, give me the freedom of a tight brief. There's a reason that we have this. Henry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think, and your background at P&G, I mean, P&G is like revered as one of the really the place where brand marketing was created. And so, but I find in my experiences, I've had a lot of inexperienced clients and a lot of clients that just aren't as sophisticated at that level. And that's why there's this kind of this schism between the client brief and the brief that a good strategist at an age. And we were talking a little bit offline before we started recording about, the bell curve. And just because you have a strategist doesn't mean that strategist is good or great or even good, right? And just because a client writes a brief doesn't mean that brief is going to be great or even good. So it's a question to me of, the agency having kind of its own internal processes that are within the safety of this is like, and I think that's what separates a good strategist from a not so good strategist, that I can understand your business. I could understand what you're being sensitive to as a client, why you've put the parameters that you've put, and reinforce them with my creative so that we don't come to you with some crazy idea that's completely outside the bounds of what you've set for us. I think recognizing what the creatives need and what the clients need, that's where the strategist really can be the most valuable, is like being that go-between that's holding hands on both sides and making the relationship work.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that my comment was going to be a lot of what you said, which is it doesn't matter a lot of times who's writing the brief. It's whether they actually know what they're doing when they write a brief, first of all. And that could be anybody. But I do agree with you that and the reason that we ended up partnering in this work is because we wanted to break down some of those walls that happen, and so we no longer needed the translator, right? So when Ann and I get in the trenches together of doing the work, there's no politics of it. There's no like, ooh, I can say this to this person, that to the, that sort of thing. And so I was very much in the camp when I was in the agency that we needed the creative brief. I was on that side of the fence because what was coming over didn't give us an assignment. It was a lot of times just a list of stuff, right? And I'm like, this isn't a brief.
Tactics.
But it relied on me as the strategist to convert that. And then, yes, I was playing that go between. It was they would bring some stuff back and I'd be like, not on strategy. And then, on the other side, it would be client, let's push you a little further than you wanted to go. But I think what it ultimately comes down to, and where I think we've broken down some of these things, is that if you can get in a room and do the work, regardless of what quote unquote role you have assigned to you, it can happen more fluidly and faster. However, I do appreciate why these things have existed for so long, because I lived them every single day. And so I think our mission is to break all of that away and just say, what's the best work we can get to? Again, though, it goes back to the partnership of an agency or a client and agency person sitting together, which isn't the norm. And so I think my opinion has evolved. I think your opinion has evolved about the brief and what that actually needs to look like. We talked a little bit about the page 2 and like the mandates not living within the brief. It's just in a lot of ways the brief is broken. And I think the people on this podcast are doing it the right way, maybe albeit differently, but there's so much bad out there. And that's what we're trying to correct, right? It's like,
Right.
if you get a bad, it's garbage in, garbage out. And
Right.
I saw so much of that throughout the course of my career that it's like everyone's trying to find a way to solve for it, or CYA, which was brought up on this, and everything in between. So.
You know, what I really find interesting is I was scanning through the topics that you've covered so far in your podcast, and I wrote down some of the titles abbreviated. It's like strategies for transforming employees into brand ambassadors, 4 ways to appropriately show vulnerability in the workplace, 4 techniques for defining and engaging your target audience, hosting a successful event, building a company mission, defining the right marketing KPIs, 4 ways to build empathy in the workplace. I just had to smile and say, so many of these topics are connected to what the brief is all about.
Yes. Yes.
Now, maybe it's because I'm biased and I have a narrow or myopic view, because that's what we talk about. But you have reached out and talked with many different people on many aspects of marketing, but all of them in one way or another, even especially maybe I should say, an event or empathy or creating a mission, they all come back to the brief in one way or another. That's impressive. Was that intentional, or does that just sort of happen?
Well, I mean, I think we talk about brief a lot. I mean, we definitely do talk about brief a lot as being like a cornerstone of alignment amongst teams. Like, so it's a tool as much as it is like a document, right? And so we always talk about keeping the quote unquote brief in the room with regards to any kind of discussions you're having, being able to have that objective, like you had said, that objective conversation versus a subjective conversation. You need to have some way by which to evaluate the work or the progress. So I think it's just a natural part of doing branding and marketing. It is the fundamental part of doing branding and marketing. So I think it is not coincidental that it's a core part of a lot of things that we've talked about. Now, how formal that brief is, I think varies with regards to what those topics you're talking about and how collaborative the process is in creating that quote unquote brief. So some of it is like you could call like mission, vision, values briefs. I mean, those are basically briefs for how you're going to operate your business, right? And how everybody's going to come together and build a culture. So it definitely is a fundamental philosophy, I think, as much as it is like a piece of paper that you do or a document that you write or a tool, like I just said, with regards to how do you do business? Like, how do you drive alignment? How do you make sure people are all on the same page? How do you have something that you can actually reflect on when you're having a conversation, an argument, a disagreement, whatever that is, so that you can have a reference point, so that you can take, maybe, even though a lot of things you said were very emotionally led, take some of the emotion out of it, right? In order to be able to have those conversations so that you can progress the work. Because fundamentally, that's what everybody's there to go do. They're there to progress work. They're there to forward a brand or forward a business. So I think it's like one of the fundamental pieces of a lot of things, even though it shows up differently depending on how the context you're talking about.
I was enjoying an episode that you did. It was fairly recent. It was, in other words, another quick hits, 4 tips for utilizing brand to differentiate in a crowded space. And you're talking to, again, I forgot his name, but he runs, or he works, for Rheingeist Brewery.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And you were talking about the why. Henry and I talk about this a lot too. It's like, if you don't understand the why, you don't understand your brand. And I might have mentioned this when I was a guest on your show, how often I encounter marketers who really understand their product, but don't get their brand at all.
Yep,
They can't explain the brand.
Yep.
That is just so frustrating because like this survey that I referenced to before we hit the record button from Peter Paul Von Wheeler and Matt Davies, their betterbriefs.com survey of marketers and creatives on the quality of marketing briefs. So many of the marketers use the creative process to try to figure out their strategy. So they're writing a brief without any strategy. Like you were just alluding to, we know what we want you to do, a website, a direct mail campaign, some social, but you don't know why you're doing it.
Yes.
and you don't know what the message is going to be and what the objective is. So they get the cart in front of the horse. How do you overcome that in your conversations with your clients?
I mean, honestly, it becomes the filter of whether or not we work with them.
Mm.
And that can be really, really tough, right? But we have gotten so crystal clear. And like you said, you ask people what their brand is, and they give you the points of difference, the point of parity, what thing they go and sell, or
The
they tell you about the
logo,
logo, the colors, the
colors.
fonts, and we really drill down. And if at the end of the day, we still come back to that's all good, but we want to go and do a website, we actually opt out at that point. So it's a
Mm.
non-negotiable for us as a business because we just fundamentally do not believe we can do right by any business without the brand, without that why, without the deeper meaning of, why they exist. I mean, we just had a whole hour-long discussion the other day with someone who asked us the question whether B2B companies needed a brand. And we were like, 100,000%. What are you at? And he was baiting us a little bit
Yeah.
with that question. But I mean, that's it. It's if you can't come along on the journey and really believe this with us and trust in our expertise on that side where you are the expert in your business all day long, but we are the expert on brand, then we won't do that work because it's never going to meet any kind of mark, and it will never be based on anything. It'll be a moving target.
It's funny that you mentioned, like, that you've mentioned it a couple of times, like that idea of, oh, we need a website, right? That's the reason I got into strategy. Really, I've been in the business for a few years, hadn't really found my stride, like what I liked about working in the agency, and I had been plugged in different departments. I had worked in traffic. I had I had done a lot. It was a small agency, so I'd been exposed to a lot of different things. And eventually I was the only one that was asking the question, well, why do they want to do that? Like, and so I realized we didn't have a strategy department. I said, we need somebody that's going to stop and ask the question. Yeah, but why do you want to do that? Because this may be an answer, but it may not be the only answer or the best answer to solve the problem that you think you have or that you're trying to solve. And having that deeper dialogue about, like, what are the things that are ailing this brand or that are holding this brand back or that need to be repaired or that are, like I said, keeping it from becoming a leader. So yeah, I fundamentally just think that I think it's a sad state of affairs. I think there's a lot of marketers who are in it, and even on the agency side too, I see this. It's just a job, right? Like, and then for me, it's about the challenge. It's about, like, solving the problem, like using my brain to solve a problem and get something from point A to point B using a logical process and creating something. It's funny, we talk a lot about our agency colleagues. They go home and they turn on the TV and they're just like consumers. Like, they're not looking at the advertising like a practitioner. I'm
Mhm.
always looking at the advertising, like analyzing, like, what the hell were they trying to say there? That ad
Yeah.
was horrible. Who approved that? Like, what was the brief there? Like,
And you don't even have to do it for more than a couple of minutes. Just
This happens. We
happens.
text
Yeah.
each other all the time about that. Did you just see that? What the hell was that?
yeah, and that's it is a real problem because we marketers and we advertising professionals turn off our professional brains too soon and don't engage in the world when that becomes a great honing skill for us. As even if we don't write briefs, if we just read briefs, we'll become better brief readers if we're creatives. And Henry has pointed out many times that strategists, they're good and bad strategists, but they're also creatives that are better at strategy than others.
Oh,
And the
100,000%.
And the creatives who ask the why, rather than just, okay, when do you want this? The order takers versus the why do you want this make the difference between a good creative and an average creative or a mediocre creative. We hear that a lot.
And I think that the creatives that ask the question why are usually the best salesmen of creative, because they can explain to a client how they got to their idea and why this idea works for the problem that's been identified. When they're strategic thinkers, they're much easier selling the work than just somebody who came up with a pretty idea that requires somebody else, like a strategist, to come in and retrofit some sort of rationale for the work or whatever.
Well, they're storytellers, right?
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
they can give the narrative all the way through. And
Yeah,
that is the commercial
this
part.
got me to thinking about X, and that got us here. And who doesn't love a good story? A client wants to know, like, oh yeah, this looks really good, but they're sold on the fact that like there was some sort of, and it doesn't, I say logical, it doesn't have to be dry, but that there was some sort of storytelling progression of how we got here, and
Mhm.
that it makes sense, that it's credible, that it's like, oh, having this crazy helium balloon over the Super Bowl, blah blah blah, now makes sense to me because of the progression of how you got there and how it fits with the brand and the problem and the target.
And that strategic thinking allows you to move away from the subjective to the objective.
Yes.
We're staying with it. This is what the brief has asked us. We've agreed on this objective. We've agreed on this is who we're talking to. So this design plus this color plus this font and this idea answers the brief, or we are responding to the brief. And so it's not subjective. I hear it so many times where marketers, when I do training, say, how do I get away from the subjective? It's, well, if you don't agree on the brief, then everything is subjective.
Yes.
Right.
I'm so tired of hearing, but I don't like blue.
Yeah.
Like, I don't
Yeah.
care.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's,
don't go to work for British Airways because blue is part of their brand colors.
I
right?
wrote an essay on LinkedIn a few years ago called, I think it was something like banish the word like from your vocabulary. And
Yeah.
it was really directed toward clients. But really anybody who's evaluating creative, right? If it's a strategist, an account person, what you like isn't relevant. The
Mhm.
questions you should be asking is this something that's likely to work? Is this something that is likely to be appreciated by the audience the way that we're intending it? Is this likely to create the awareness that we're looking for? Whether you personally like it or not, like, it doesn't make any difference. I think in that piece I write, if we screen tested All in the Family, the classic sitcom today, it would never get produced. You can imagine the people with their dials in the test audience and afterwards in the focus group saying, that Archie's so mean, couldn't he be nicer? It would have killed the whole show.
Right. Right.
And so the fact is sometimes what works is intangible. So applying your personal filter of like and dislike, it's like, does this make sense? Is it likely to work? I think are better questions.
Plus clients are way too close. They're not the audience. They're just not the audience. And they have to be able to stand back and say, I know too much.
Well, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And I think you guys bring up a bigger question, which was another sticking point, which was always the creative review process. Right. So when creative came back and you're trying to analyze it against a brief, it's like, what is the criteria? And Henry, I loved what you said about that, because it's like, what is the criteria by which we're going to evaluate this work? A lot of times everybody had a different set of criteria, and obviously the person with the most stars wins with regards to that. And you always start with the ABM and let him get crucified or her get crucified, and you kind of go up through the chain until the holier than thou, like brand manager, marketing director, whatever, states what their opinion is, and that's what you kind of go with, right? So I think what really is needed in order to really evaluate if creative is going to do what it's supposed to do against a brief is really clear criteria for which you're evaluating it for, and making sure that there's some sort of like quote unquote scoring system that allows that to actually come through in a very objective way, not a subjective way. Because you're totally right. I mean, Howard, like, we're so close to the work, we fall in love. Even agency side, I mean, I used to just chuckle when the creatives used to review their work and laugh at their own work. I'm like, now we know we're a little bit too close to the work, right? But it's the same thing with, on the client side, which is like, we're so close to what we need to deliver from the brand, product, whatever functionality benefit, that's all we can see. So the criteria got skewed no matter, depending on what side you were looking at it from. And so having a more robust, very more, like, I guess, objective view of how to evaluate the creative when it comes against a brief, I think is another way of being able to make this process more fortuitous for everybody.
Well, one of the things I've always faulted marketers with, and I quiz them when I used to do a training on how to evaluate creative. I'm disappointed with where it is now, and maybe I'll bring it back. But one of the questions I would ask marketers is, can you name 5 campaigns that won awards, not just for creativity, but for effectiveness? And they couldn't do it.
Mm-mm.
They don't know. So they are isolated or in a vacuum and don't know what's out in the world. Not only,
I know one.
okay, well, good. I'm glad, and I expected you would because you work for P&G, and it has to be one of your.
Tie-dye did.
Absolutely, but the fact that so many marketers don't even know what's being done in their own category, much less what's winning award for effectiveness out there, means they have no criteria to compare the work that they're looking at in the conference room when the creatives come back. So it's just about, as Henry says, it's just about what they like, because that's all they know. And that's a false criteria.
You know, and this goes back to, you know, the whole training thing, but you mentioned something really interesting, and it's a pet peeve of mine, which is the going around the round table for feedback at a creative review. In my opinion, the way that it should work is that the ultimate decision maker should speak first, and if anybody has another thought that challenges that, they should be free to bring it up. But this formality of, we're going to start with the most junior person, and as if wisdom would come from the mouth of babes. The reality is that the ultimate decision maker is the one that should be most knowledgeable about the brand, about the objectives, and should say, I want to approve this idea because of X, Y, and Z reasons, unless there's any objections. And then the people around the table should learn from that person, because someday they're going to be the ultimate person responsible. I don't agree with this whole thing of, oh, well, we have to let the junior person talk. Like that to me, because you're going to get a bunch of conflicting feedback. And I think there's different ways to skin a cat. And I worked on the McDonald's business for 5 years, and they did something that felt a little strange, but actually I thought it worked well, which was, we would go in, we would pitch the idea, and then they would ask us to leave. And they would have that deliberation internal. Like, we didn't have to take the feedback from the junior person, or however they handled it in the room, that was up to them. But we would come back, there would be one person that would give us the agreed upon feedback. And that basically eliminated a lot of that confusion, a lot of that time wasting. Like they hashed it out internally, and whatever their protocol was of junior person speaks first or whatever, wasn't an issue. But
Henry, that's so politically incorrect. I mean, I agree with you 100% that roundtable, because we've talked about this before. I've been skewered for saying things like that in a workshop that I've done, because it's just politically incorrect. We want to use this opportunity to train our juniors. So we want to hear from our juniors, but they don't have a set of rules.
You know what, that old saw about the committee designing things, you end up with a camel or a minivan. Like, it's not anything that anybody really wants.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you the best process in my 20 years at P&G, and this was by Alex Keith, and I think she's probably going to be the first female CEO of P&G at one point here, hopefully in the near future. Engineer by background too, which is another reason why I love her. But what she would do is she would go around the room, and this is, Henry, to your point, this was usually with mute on, right? So the agency wasn't hearing this. And she would let everybody speak, and she would say, give me one thing you like, one thing you don't like. You have 1 minute, right? Or 1 minute or 2 minutes. Just tell me what you like, what you don't like. And she would jot that down. She would let everybody speak, but you can't pontificate. You can't get on your soapbox or anything like that. You just had one thing you like, one thing you don't like. And when she was done, she goes, okay, I listened to all of you. This is what I'm going to go do. And that's what she would deliver then to the agency. I felt like that was brilliant, because everybody felt heard, right? So everybody got their chance to say something. It wasn't like the junior person goes first and everybody just basically, just nails him or her. It was like everybody was speaking from their point of view. And then she consolidated that into a very succinct way of being able to communicate and progress it forward. You may not like what she went or what decision she came to, but
it's her role. It's her role.
Yeah, it's her job.
And that abdication of responsibility is really what I'm gets me, it's like
Mhm.
you're the senior brand manager, you're the portfolio manager, whatever the role is. Don't abdicate your responsibility to the juniors or to a committee. I feel the same way with like creative pre-testing, like in focus groups. I already mentioned the Archie Bunker example, but if you're a brand manager that's worth anything, you're going to have a better idea of what's going to be right for the brand than some randomly recruited non-marketing people who you're showing like pencil sketches to with, with a voiceover, and they're getting hung up about like, oh, is this going to be filmed or is it going to be animated?
Yeah, been there.
Yeah. It's
That's
stupid.
like concept reviews.
Yeah.
Right.
Let me ask both April and let me just ask you, could you each tell us two, maybe three things that you've learned most from your previous life that you've brought to this new partnership and I think maybe, Ann, you've already talked about this way to go about reviewing creative. I think that's brilliant. I'm going to steal that too, by the way. But could you share with us, two or three things from your previous life that you think are really helpful that you brought to this new partnership and this new company that you're doing?
Yeah. So, number one, I think for me is it would drive me crazy when the agency would be pitching their agenda. And I I appreciate the need for, the way we do work and how we make money and all of those types of things. But what I didn't appreciate was when we would go into clients, and I'm paraphrasing, but say basically, you're dumb and we're smart and we do it this way and this is the only way we do it, you can take it or leave it. And I just felt like that was such a missed opportunity. And so, one of the things that I focus on and we focus on now with our clients is you are the expert in your business. That's what you do day to day. We are the branding expert. I've said this already on the show. And I had one client who contextualized it for me and said, you know why this works? Because I know this much about this much. I know my business in and out. I know it so well, but that's my purview, right? And we've kind of spoken to this on the episode.
The myopia of the
I'm in
brand
this
manager.
every day. Like we had one guy on that was in the liquor category, and he said I had to convince everyone that not everyone wakes up thinking about, I don't know, Jameson or whatever, right? Every day. That's not the world. Versus our job on the agency when we're good is we know this much about this much of their business, right? So we're pulling in trends and learnings and things from our experience and the things we've seen out there in the world across clients. And when we come to them, it may not immediately make sense, but when we start to make the narrative, the story, whatever, you're like, I can see their value and we see the other side's value. I didn't like that contention and I felt like it set up the wrong relationship. And then the other thing, and I've kind of talked around this too, is I don't ever again want to do work for the sake of doing work. If it is not going to move the needle, if there are not metrics, KPIs, success criteria tied to it, I do not want to do it ever again in my life. Because as the strategist, a lot of times, or the account person, depending on the company, my responsibility was the bad guy a lot of times, right? It was shut down this great idea that they loved and they laughed at and they fell in love with. But I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, am I the only one with any brain here sometimes? And then on the client side, it was, I'm trying to give them something that maybe I didn't entirely believe in. And so that's why our philosophy, and you heard me say it in the beginning, is to be able to build business through the lens of brand. So those are the two main things.
Cool.
Okay.
Before we go to Ann, I want to just address one thing that you said regarding the agency pitching its agenda to the client. And I've come to this observation. I think that one of the biggest disconnects, if not the biggest disconnect in the whole agency client relationship model, is you have a pitch, there's multiple agencies involved, hundreds of man hours sunk into by each agency, they award the business, and at no point in the RFP document, in the meetings, is there ever a point where the client and the agency sit down and ask each other, what's your vision of creativity on this brand? What do you think is good work? What do you like, there's always this mismatch of the agency. I say, the typical agency person wants to win a lion at Cannes. The typical client wants to send his kid to college, right? And so those are two very different, objectives for their careers, right? Like, and so there are some clients that want to win a lion at Cannes, and so the agency and the clients that want to do that should get together, but that's never part of the process, right? Like, so you end up with this mismatch, like the agency's trying to sell these highfalutin ideas and these big things, and the client says, I just need to get from A to B. And I think that's fine. And they could probably find half a dozen agencies that would be happy to take them from A to B. But that's why we have this never ending cycle of agency reviews, because the agency has its own agenda and the client naturally has its agenda. And really, the client's the one that's paying the freight. So it's incumbent upon not just the agency, but the client also, because if we're going to hire a new vendor, we got to make sure that this vendor has a similar vision to what we think about this very thorny subject called creativity.
Yes. Well, I feel like I've won the lottery because I have actually some Cannes Lions, and I sent my kid to college, so I've checked all those boxes.
Good for you.
Yeah, but I think about it. So I've seen a couple that I would say. One is the what we are very hyper focused on, and April alluded to this, was the business oriented nature of the work that we do. So what we have done, and I think I've had some good influence in this, is like really restructuring the way that we even propose work to make sure it's extremely deliverable oriented. I mean, when I used to get pitches or proposals, it would be like, okay, we have this very long upfront, like kind of discovery phase. So you have to endure that for 6 months before we even actually do work. And then by the time, we are actually getting the work, we've actually run out of budgets, and now we have to kind of rescope. So what me and April have done is we've really really flipped that on its head, and we've really switched the way that we do work so that everything is very deliverable oriented. At the end of each phase of work, you're getting something that you can take as a business, as a brand, and you can execute it, activate it, get upon it, action it. And that might be the only thing that you need from us, right? And so it's meant to be very much progressive in that way, so that our client feels like they're always getting value from us. They're always getting something they can use, and they don't have to wait, because we focus on small, medium-sized businesses. They don't have the money or the time or the patience to sit there and just wait 6 months, a year, in order for something to kind of evolve and reveal itself. They need action and they need results right now. And so when April said like the KPIs, all that stuff is super important for the small, medium-sized businesses, so they know that the work we're doing is good work. And I think that's another big thing that I think that I've learned and I brought to the table is, like, in order to know that you have good work, you have to have KPIs that evaluate whether or not you have good work. And that shouldn't be something that agency is like scared of putting down on the paper, because like, well, what if it doesn't do as good as we think, blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, put your money where your mouth is. If you really believe in what you're doing, you should be able to measure it and call it a test to learn, which is what we do a lot in order to kind of make sure that we got the right creative. That's another big thing that we've kind of brought to the table, and we do a lot, is like, we're going to kind of learn our way into this, because a lot of times the clients don't know, and you don't have enough information to be like, ta-da, here it is. Here's like your silver bullet, right? You have to kind of learn your way into it. So we plan for that. We budget for that. We scope for that. I think the other thing that we really, really learned, and we've talked like a lot about this, but to kind of put the stake in the ground, is we believe 99% of business problems can be solved through brand. I mean, so really, if you are really going to be very mindful about what is wrong with your business, almost always it can be solved with some element of brand. And so that's another thing I think we brought to the table. And that was the thing that I really started realizing, and it seems kind of weird to say, as I was going through my P&G world, and I was kind of talking about, how do we take these commoditized brands that everybody loves and they've loved for 75 years, like Tide, and get more household penetration? I mean, when you get to that point in a brand's lifetime, I mean, you're sitting at maybe 45% household penetration. Getting another quarter of household penetration, another half of, I mean, that's actually big money, right? But you can't just get the quarter and a half by saying, oh, we get out more stains. Like, everybody knows that. If you ask like people and you said, what's the best laundry detergent out there? 9 out of 10 people will tell you it's Tide, but only half those people are using it. Well, how do you get the other half of them to use it? You have to deliver brand. You have to deliver an experiential thing that actually creates some sort of emotion, that they fall in love with the brand in a different way. And so that's the other thing that we really, really focus on. And so that's like a core of how we actually activate all of the work that we do.
Well, I tell you what, I have added your podcast to my favorites now on my podcast app.
Yay!
And I'm going to come back to listen to you guys because it is really good stuff. I'm going to steal a lot of stuff. You know, one of my favorite sayings is amateurs plagiarize, professionals steal.
Yeah.
So, and I like to steal liberally. I don't let my students hear me say that because that's a different message altogether. But you have unambiguously taught a lot of valuable lessons. So April Martini and Candido, owners of Forthright People and the hosts of Marketing Smarts, thank you for joining Henry and me on the Brief Brothers. We loved having you.
Thank you. We love being
really
here.
appreciate it.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. And together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.